Alice Powell never imagined she'd find herself starting over again in her late 50s, but there was a strange kind of clarity that came with having everything fall apart. After her divorce and the sudden death of her sister within the same year, she left her job as an administrative manager at a law office and moved to a modest one-story home on the edge of a small town in Northern California. It wasn't remote, but it wasn't suburban either. Just a quiet, in-between pocket of residential space where neighbors had tidy fences, dogs barked in predictable patterns, and the mail came like clockwork every morning at 10. The house sat on a slightly sloped lot with a large backyard that was overgrown but full of potential. For Alice, who had spent the last 25 years waking up to office air conditioning and fluorescent lights, the backyard became something close to sacred, her own green canvas where she could prune, plant, and breathe without someone asking her to answer phones or fix someone else's mistake. She didn't buy the place outright, but she used her savings to put down a substantial deposit, signed a fixed-rate mortgage with cautious optimism, and told herself that if nothing else, she'd finally have space to think. For the first few weeks, everything unfolded just as she had hoped. She hired a young landscaper from the neighborhood, a quiet guy named Jalen who trimmed the hedges, pulled out the invasive ivy, and built a simple trellis over the corner of the garden that she wanted to turn into a shaded nook for her morning coffee. She ordered gravel, installed a drip irrigation system, and bought second-hand garden furniture that she sanded and painted herself. The work wasn't easy on her hands, but it was honest, physical, and grounding. Each evening she sat on the porch with her shoes off, dirt still under her fingernails, watching the hummingbirds dart through the lavender, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was being measured against anything. She didn't miss the city, or the silence of her empty apartment, or the endless, recycled small talk with people who were only ever half listening. There was something about living alone on a property with no one to answer to that gave her a sense of control she hadn't realized she needed so badly. The neighbors, for the most part, kept to themselves. There was an elderly couple on one side who waved politely when she checked the mailbox, and a family with young twins across the street who played in their front yard on weekends. On the other side, however, was Karen Littman. Alice met her within days of moving in. Karen approached her driveway without an invitation, carrying a welcome basket that was overly coordinated and obviously curated to impress: artisan jam, lemon tea, shortbread cookies wrapped in lace. She introduced herself as if she were part of some homeowner's council, though Alice would later learn there wasn't one. Karen was in her early 60s with pearl earrings and stiffly ironed linen shirts, and she spoke with the tone of someone used to people agreeing with her, even when she was saying absolutely nothing. She said things like, "Our street has a rhythm," and "Most people here appreciate predictability." The visit lasted 15 minutes, and Alice thanked her sincerely for the basket. Karen looked over the backyard and commented, not unkindly, "I see you're getting a lot of sun in that corner. Might be blinding come summer." At the time, Alice smiled and nodded, assuming it was just an odd remark. But in hindsight, it was the first sign of what was coming. 2 weeks after that first meeting, Alice noticed the security camera. It was mounted just under the eaves of Karen's second-floor window, pointed directly at the dividing fence that separated their backyards. Alice only noticed it because the sun caught the lens one morning while she was out watering. It was subtle, encased in a sleek white housing, but its orientation was unmistakable. It had a clear view of the entirety of Alice's garden, the patio, and even part of her kitchen window. She tried to convince herself that maybe it was a doorbell camera or some general-purpose surveillance fixture, but the longer she stared at it, the more obvious its angle became. It wasn't facing the street. It wasn't aimed at Karen's own backyard. It was focused on her, on Alice. At first, she tried to ignore it. She reminded herself that it was just a camera and that many people had them now. After all, her landscaper had a dash cam, and the gas station down the road had multiple security systems. Maybe Karen had experienced a break-in, or maybe she simply liked to feel in control. But the feeling of being watched began to grow roots in Alice's mind. She started hesitating before going out in her bathrobe to water the plants, and she found herself glancing up toward the camera more often than she cared to admit. The sense of calm she'd cultivated so deliberately began to dissolve, replaced by a kind of low-level anxiety that made it difficult to relax, even when she was alone. Eventually, she decided to address it directly. One afternoon, she walked over and rang Karen's doorbell. The chime was delicate, too high-pitched to be pleasant. Karen answered almost immediately as if she'd been expecting her. She didn't invite Alice in. She stood on the threshold, her posture polite but firm. Alice, ever diplomatic, asked if the camera was necessary and mentioned, without accusation, that it seemed to be aimed at her yard. Karen's smile didn't waver, but her eyes narrowed just slightly. "Oh, it's just for security," she said breezily. "These days you never know who might be watching us, right? I'd rather be safe than sorry. And besides, if you're not doing anything wrong, it shouldn't matter." The phrase landed like a slap. Alice didn't respond immediately, unsure if she was supposed to argue or apologize. Instead, she nodded and walked back home, feeling strangely humiliated by the interaction. That night, she poured herself a glass of wine and sat in the garden, staring at the stars. But no matter where she looked, she felt that lens in her peripheral vision, small, silent, and always present. Over the next few days, things got worse. She began to notice subtle changes in Karen's behavior. Blinds being pulled open when Alice stepped outside, motion-triggered lights activating on Karen's side even when no one was there, and twice she caught Karen standing near the fence pretending to inspect her plants while clearly looking over. It wasn't overt harassment, it was something quieter, more suffocating, a persistent reminder that she was being observed, judged, and catalogued. Alice's hands, once steady while pruning roses or repotting basil, now shook slightly. She started forgetting where she placed things and found herself double-checking that the doors were locked before bed, even though nothing had actually happened. The tipping point came one morning when she received a letter in the mail from a landscaping oversight committee she hadn't known existed. It was unsigned but typed formally, and it mentioned concerns about unregulated visual installations on her property and potential disturbances to the environmental harmony of the block. It was absurd. She hadn't installed anything, just a few trellises and planters. But the phrasing matched Karen's style too well to be a coincidence. Someone had gone out of their way to fabricate a problem out of thin air. That same afternoon, Alice made a decision. She wasn't going to ask again. She wasn't going to apologize for existing on her own land. She researched the sun's path through her yard, checked the reflective properties of various surfaces, and placed an order for a large, polished aluminum panel through a construction supply website. It arrived in 3 days. With Jalen's help, she mounted it at the far end of her garden, angled precisely so that at a certain time of day, when the sun hit just right, it would send a powerful glare directly toward Karen's camera and the second-floor window. She didn't say a word. She didn't leave a note or send an email. She simply stood in the middle of her garden that afternoon, watering the begonias, while the sunlight bounced off the panel and created a brilliant halo of reflected heat and light across Karen's yard. For the first time in weeks, Alice felt invisible. Not because she was being erased, but because she had finally taken herself out of someone else's frame. It wasn't revenge, it was redirection. And it was only the beginning. The day after Alice installed the mirror, she noticed something strange about the air, something just barely different from the usual morning quiet. It wasn't the chirping of birds or the sound of sprinklers, but rather the absence of noise from Karen's side of the fence. There was no movement, no morning pruning, no humming from her portable speaker, which usually streamed classical music across the hedges by 9. Alice found herself stepping out barefoot, holding a mug of coffee, waiting to feel something. Maybe guilt, maybe vindication. But all she felt was the warmth of sunlight on her forearm and the stillness of her own garden returning. For a while, that was enough. Later that afternoon, as the sun climbed higher, she stepped into her yard to find a large circle of scorched grass directly on Karen's side, right where the reflective light had been strongest the day before. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was significant. Maybe 5 or 6 feet across, a deep yellow ring bordered by brown edges that would be hard to recover without reseeding. The circle looked surgical in its precision. Not random, not accidental. Intentional only by physics, but from the other side of the fence, it might have seemed otherwise. Alice stared at it for a few moments without expression, then turned back to her kitchen and began washing the dishes from breakfast. She didn't feel triumphant, not exactly, but something inside her had finally settled, some sense that she had regained control in a place where she had been slowly disassembled. By dusk, the silence was broken. Karen came to the fence not with a complaint, but with a presence that was heavier than usual. She didn't yell. She didn't even raise her voice. Instead, she stood with her arms crossed, waiting for Alice to acknowledge her. When Alice finally did, putting down her hose and lifting her gaze, Karen simply said, "You've damaged my property." Her tone was smooth, like the beginning of a deposition. She gestured toward the circle on her lawn, then continued, "I don't think you understand the consequences of intentional harm, or what happens when someone acts in a way that's considered retaliatory. I've recorded the light coming off your little mirror, and I've documented the time of day. I've spoken to someone who can make a formal report." Alice didn't answer right away. Her instinct, honed from years of working under people who thought volume and condescension were signs of authority, was to remain neutral, to nod, to deflect, to say, "I'll look into it." But something had shifted. The comment about "your little mirror" wasn't just insulting. It was laced with that smug assurance of someone who believed they were untouchable. So instead, Alice answered calmly, "The mirror is legal. It's a decorative panel. It reflects sunlight. I don't control where the sun decides to land." Karen's eyes narrowed, and her smile, tight, narrow, a sliver of something restrained, suggested that she was not used to being challenged without immediate compliance. She didn't reply, didn't escalate in the moment. She simply nodded once and turned away. But that night, as Alice sat on her porch, she found the silence once again replaced, this time with movement in the shadows. At first, she thought it might have been raccoons or cats, but the way the motion light flicked on and caught just the barest glimpse of something retreating through the alley between their houses sent a familiar wave of unease through her chest. She stayed up later than usual, not out of fear but out of a kind of wary anticipation. She kept the lights low, curtains open just enough to watch the yard, and waited for something she couldn't name. Nothing came. Until morning. Alice opened her front door to find a dead rat on her welcome mat. Its body was stiff, placed with unsettling precision, like a message, not a casualty. She stared at it for a long time. Too long, maybe, until her mind finished rejecting the coincidence. There was no reason for it to be there. She lived clean. There were no traps, no garbage left outside. She hadn't seen rats anywhere in the neighborhood. When she finally disposed of the body, double-bagging it and putting it in the outside bin, she didn't bother calling anyone. She knew exactly what it was meant to communicate. Still, she wouldn't give Karen the satisfaction of flinching. She didn't speak to her. She didn't adjust the mirror. Instead, she documented everything. She started keeping a log of events, not because she expected a courtroom, but because it gave her structure. Day, time, what was seen, what was heard, what changed. She took photos of the rat, photos of the scorched lawn from her angle. She made note of anything unusual, mail that arrived late, utility bills that had the wrong digits. She wasn't becoming paranoid, she was becoming methodical. A former colleague once told her that calm is just preparation in disguise, and for the first time in her personal life, she decided to apply it. A few days later, she received a letter, not in the mail, but taped to her front gate. It was printed on heavy cream paper, too formal to be handwritten, too sterile to feel neighborly. It bore no return address, but the language was precise, legalistic. This correspondence is to notify the resident of 17 Caldwell Lane that activities occurring on said property may constitute a public nuisance or be construed as an environmental hazard, under Regional Glare Ordinance 4.6b. Cease and desist recommended until further evaluation. There was no signature, no city seal, no official heading, just language wrapped in intimidation. Alice read it 3 times. She scanned the paper for watermarks, compared it to actual city communications she had received, and quickly realized it was a fabrication, a bluff. It didn't even have her full name, just the address. She filed it in a folder and wrote the date in her log. It was childish. It was calculated. It was designed to shake her. It didn't work. What did shake her, however, was the subtle but undeniable change in the energy of the street. Her usual wave from the elderly couple next door turned into a hesitant glance. The children across the street no longer played near her driveway. Packages began arriving with incorrect address notes taped on them, even though the labels were right. A neighbor she didn't know well, a woman with gardening gloves and sharp eyes, gave her a look one afternoon that lingered too long to be innocent. Alice didn't like paranoia. She didn't believe in conspiracies. But she believed in influence, and she believed in the way some people used polite society like a weapon, disguising manipulation as concern. Karen had lived on the block for nearly 20 years. Alice had been there for barely 3 months. It didn't take much effort to imagine how quickly one story, framed just so, could spread. An aggressive new neighbor, a mirror that was blinding, odd behavior at night, a refusal to cooperate. It didn't have to be true. It just had to be told first. Still, Alice refused to be driven out. She didn't retreat. She didn't lower the mirror or change her habits. Instead, she doubled down on order. She repainted her fence. She power washed her walkway. She pruned everything to uniform height. She wrote to the city, not to complain, but to request clarification on glare ordinances, complete with photos and sun charts. She made sure her property taxes were up to date. She wasn't preparing for a fight. She was erasing the possibility of being painted as the instigator. Then, without warning, the mirror disappeared. She came out one morning, and it was gone. No broken glass. No sign of entry. The bolts were unscrewed cleanly, and the panel itself had vanished without a trace. Her heart didn't race. Her stomach did, because this wasn't vandalism. This was surgical, clean, silent. A removal that said, "We are not afraid of your presence." It wasn't just about the mirror. It was about authority. And the message was clear. Someone had crossed into her space and taken something she had installed legally, purposefully, and visibly. Alice called the police, not to overreact but to create a record. She gave them the details, filed a report, kept the tone neutral. They were polite but uninvested. One officer asked if she had surveillance footage, and she almost laughed. Instead, she said no and thanked him for his time. When she hung up, she stood in her yard and looked at the empty patch of ground where the mirror had stood. Her garden was alive with color, but all she saw was absence. The removal had been deliberate, coordinated, and she knew, beyond any reasonable doubt, that it wasn't the end of it. It was just the next move in a slow, quiet war, and the heat had only just begun. Alice didn't expect the police to do anything after the mirror disappeared, but she also didn't expect how quickly Karen would begin to fill the vacuum left behind. Within 48 hours of the report, a new camera appeared. This time not on the second floor of Karen's house, but mounted on a pole at the edge of her own garden, right near the shared property line. The housing was new, dark, and bulkier than the first, and the angle was not even subtle. It faced directly into Alice's yard, not elevated, not indirect, but bold and centered. If the first camera was surveillance under the pretense of security, this was a declaration. This was personal. Alice stood on her patio the morning she noticed it, coffee in hand, and simply stared at the lens. She didn't bother looking away. She knew that's what Karen wanted, to catch her reacting, to catch her uncomfortable. And maybe she was, but not in the way Karen expected. It wasn't fear or anxiety anymore. It was something colder. It was the beginning of exhaustion, the realization that some people didn't want to win a fight. They wanted to turn your life into one. She spent that day gathering her notes. Everything she'd recorded so far, photos, timestamps, documents, emails, screenshots, and that unsigned cease and desist letter, was organized and placed into a binder. She wasn't planning on marching it down to the courthouse or launching a civil case that would eat up her energy for a year, but she needed it to exist. It wasn't for the police. It wasn't even for Karen. It was for her, to remind herself that she wasn't imagining it, that this wasn't some minor misunderstanding between neighbors. This was targeted, strategic, and deliberate. By the following week, the pattern shifted again. The motion lights on Karen's property began triggering multiple times per night, even though Alice wasn't outside. One evening around 2 a.m., Alice was awakened by the sudden burst of floodlight streaming directly into her bedroom through the blinds. When she got up and peeked outside, she saw no movement, just the light glaring at her window like an interrogation lamp. She waited. 10 minutes later, the light cut off. 2 nights later, it happened again. On the 3rd night, she recorded it. She brought it up in a carefully worded email to the city's neighborhood affairs liaison, not accusing Karen by name, but requesting clarity about permissible lighting positions on shared property lines. She attached the video clip, added the timestamps, and politely asked if this qualified as a residential light nuisance. She didn't expect immediate action, but she wanted the question asked in a public system. Paper trails mattered. In response, she received a short reply. "We are reviewing local compliance with outdoor lighting standards. Thank you for your inquiry." A placeholder, but a seed planted. Karen must have noticed. The next week, Alice's trash wasn't picked up. At first, she assumed it was a simple oversight. But when she walked her bin back up to the driveway, she saw the reason. Her trash can had been moved 4 feet down the sidewalk, slightly past the boundary of her property. The garbage truck driver had skipped it completely. Alice wheeled it back up, puzzled. She didn't say anything. 2 days later, it happened again, this time with a small handwritten note left under the lid. Keep within your own space. No signature. She filed it with the rest of the documents. The following day, her water pressure dropped. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was noticeable. When she tried to water the garden that evening, the hose pressure was low enough that the sprinkler barely rotated. She checked the system, the outdoor valves, the filters. Everything was intact. The indoor water flow remained consistent. Only the outdoor faucet had changed. She contacted the local utility provider, and they sent a technician, who politely confirmed there was no city-side issue and recommended she check her plumbing connections. The next morning, the water returned to normal as if nothing had happened. Karen didn't need to say a word. The escalation wasn't dramatic. It was exhausting. It was slow-drip hostility dressed in silence. And the worst part wasn't the individual incidents. It was the space they occupied in Alice's mind. She began triple-checking locks not because she feared for her safety, but because she feared being set up. She started photographing her own garden weekly, in case someone damaged it and claimed it was already like that. She stored a copy of her home insurance policy in her glove compartment, printed and highlighted. She placed her binder near the front door, ready to hand off. But she wasn't panicking. She was adapting. Her lawyer, an even-tempered woman named Renee, finally stepped in after Alice forwarded everything she had. Renee wasn't alarmed. She was focused. She read the emails, watched the footage, reviewed the notes, and gave Alice the best advice she'd received in months. Don't engage directly. Don't retaliate. Just document. Let me write the first letter. The letter, composed in precise legal language, didn't accuse. It outlined. It acknowledged a pattern of behaviors, listed them without embellishment, and formally requested that any surveillance equipment pointed at Alice's property be removed or repositioned within a reasonable time frame under existing privacy expectations. It also made one thing explicitly clear. This letter constituted the first formal step, and further contact would proceed through legal channels. Karen received it. There was no reply. But things changed almost immediately. The following Saturday, 2 unmarked workers arrived at the edge of Karen's property with what looked like surveying equipment. They weren't city employees, no uniforms, no badges, but they carried clipboards and walked the boundary with quiet deliberation. Alice watched from her kitchen window as they took measurements, snapped photos, and spoke to no one. An hour later, they packed up and left. Karen didn't emerge once during the visit. That night, a car idled outside Alice's home for 20 minutes. It didn't park. It didn't flash its lights. It simply sat, engine running, headlights off, far enough away not to warrant attention but close enough to be noticed. Alice, already on edge, resisted the urge to storm outside or call the police. She noted the time, wrote down the make and model, and waited until it pulled away. She didn't sleep much that night. 2 days later, a city code enforcement vehicle stopped in front of her property. A man in an orange vest walked the curb, clipboard in hand, and appeared to check something off. He didn't knock. He didn't speak to anyone. Alice approached him carefully and asked if there was a problem. He looked up, mildly surprised, and explained that he was responding to a report about unauthorized exterior structures. When Alice asked what structure, he hesitated and glanced at her fence. Possibly a glare-producing panel, he said. Though I don't see one here. I filed a police report when that panel was stolen, Alice replied calmly. There's no structure left, but I'm glad you came. It's good someone's finally looking at this. He blinked. It was stolen. She nodded. Clean removal, no notice. I have the report number if you need it. He didn't. He thanked her and left. The next day, she received a letter from the city stating there were no current violations on her property. Karen responded not with words, but with lawn care. That weekend, she reseeded the burnt circle of grass, installed an ornamental fountain, and surrounded it with pristine new hedges. It was immaculate, orderly, pristine. But Alice saw it for what it was, a reset. Karen wasn't admitting defeat. She was reloading. She wasn't going to escalate with noise or confrontation. She was going to do what people like her always did, drown her opponents in performance, weaponize aesthetics, and smile through the slow grind of harassment. But Alice had changed too. She upgraded her fence. She installed motion-activated lighting, this time with inward-facing coverage only. She signed up for a monthly legal retainer and began drafting a formal incident summary to send to her insurance provider just in case. She bought a second, smaller mirror, not as a replacement, but as a reminder, and she mounted it indoors on the wall opposite the kitchen, angled toward her window. Its only purpose was reflection. Not of light, of memory, because Alice knew now what this was. It wasn't about a camera. It wasn't about a mirror. It was about territory, about people who believed silence was compliance, and about what happens when the quiet ones decide they're done being watched. For several weeks, everything remained still on the surface. The tension didn't disappear. It simply folded itself into the fabric of daily life, like a hidden seam in an otherwise neat garment. Alice kept her routines predictable, her communications precise, her responses formal and brief. Karen, true to form, stopped speaking entirely. There were no more veiled comments over the fence, no false pleasantries on the sidewalk, no notes taped to the bin. She had returned to her fortress of curated quiet, but the silence itself had a different weight now. It wasn't the absence of hostility, it was its containment. A coiled thing behind polished windows and sculpted hedges. Alice suspected that Karen wasn't done. She was just waiting for another lever to pull. Then came the letter from the county. Unlike the anonymous threats and fabricated warnings from before, this envelope bore an official seal and was mailed through certified delivery. Inside was a formal notice of a pending review regarding the use of reflective surfaces on residential property, specifically concerning unauthorized light emission in a residential corridor with potential environmental and nuisance implications. The language was careful, almost surgical, and it referred to her by full legal name. There was no direct accusation, but the implication was unmistakable. Someone had submitted a report under official channels, with sufficient documentation to trigger a response. And though Alice had long since removed the mirror and had a police report on file to prove it was gone, the wording of the letter suggested the issue was still open. She had been pulled into a bureaucratic process, one that required her to justify the absence of something she no longer had. Alice didn't panic. She scanned and sent the letter to Renee, who called her the next day with a tone of irritation barely masked under professionalism. "It's procedural nonsense," she said, "but that doesn't mean it can't hurt you. They're testing for a paper trail weakness. You did the right thing logging everything, but now we have to take the initiative. Let's get ahead of it." Renee prepared a formal response to the county, attaching the police report, photographs showing the absence of any reflective installation, the confirmation email from the city inspector who had cleared her property, and a notarized affidavit from Alice detailing the sequence of events, including the original installation, the removal, and the harassment that followed. They mailed it, filed a digital copy, and requested written confirmation that the matter was closed. It was the kind of thorough response that didn't just answer a complaint. It made clear that Alice was no longer alone or disorganized. She had backing. She had documentation. She was not vulnerable in the way Karen likely remembered her. For a few days, things were quiet again. Alice returned to her garden. The roses had rebounded, the succulents were thriving, and even the basil, which had looked like it wouldn't survive the heat wave, was firming up again. She spent her mornings trimming and her evenings reading on the porch, back turned to the fence, pretending not to notice the sound of Karen's new wind chime, which had been hung specifically to catch the breeze whenever Alice sat outside. The sound wasn't aggressive. It was soft, hollow, but relentless in its timing. It was another subtle strategy, intrusion through atmosphere. And yet, for a while, Alice managed to ignore it. The mirror was gone, the lights were contained, and her legal response had, at the very least, forced the escalation into official channels, where lies had to wear paperwork. Until the landscaper came back. Not hers, Karen's. A new team of workers showed up one afternoon with high-end machinery, the kind used for grading soil and adjusting irrigation lines. Alice thought nothing of it at first. Many homeowners hired landscaping teams, especially after reseeding or installing new features. But this team didn't stay on Karen's side. They crossed the boundary, casually, as if by mistake, and began clearing brush near the far end of Alice's garden fence. Alice stepped outside and walked down the path toward them, raising her voice above the noise. "Excuse me, you're on the wrong property." The man operating the machine stopped, looked up with a squint, and signaled the others to pause. One of them, clipboard in hand, approached her with a rehearsed smile. "We were told this part of the lot was a shared buffer zone," Karen said. He stopped himself. Ms. Littman said there was a verbal agreement with the previous owner about shared maintenance. Alice's face didn't change. She asked if they had a work order. The man nodded, handed her a laminated sheet that looked suspiciously official until she saw the footnote. Courtesy plan only, not legally binding. There was no permit number, no contractor ID, Just a list of services and a series of dotted lines that framed vague property markers. "This is not a shared zone," she said firmly, "and I am the only person authorized to approve work on this property. You need to stop and leave now." The workers didn't argue. They left, but the message had landed. Karen was testing for legal ambiguity, seeing if she could stretch the memory of a previous arrangement into a loophole. Alice called Renee again. "They're trying to manufacture a boundary dispute," Renee said bluntly. "It's a common move. If they can't get you to back off, they try to make the property itself unstable. Blurred edges, contested maintenance, anything that turns your space into a question mark." She told Alice to contact a surveyor. Not the city, not a friend, but a licensed, bonded land surveyor to officially remap her lot and document the fence lines. It cost Alice $1,200 and took 4 days to schedule, but the results were clean. No encroachment, no ambiguity. The fence was original, and the lines matched the title deed exactly. When Alice received the report, she made 6 copies. 1 went to Renee, 1 to her insurance provider, 1 she stored in her fireproof lockbox. The other 3 she delivered personally, 1 to the county office, 1 to the neighborhood affairs liaison, and 1 directly into Karen Littman's mailbox, folded neatly with a yellow post-it note that read, "No ambiguity exists." The response was a change in climate. Over the next week, Alice began noticing new behavior. Karen didn't leave her house during the day. Her mail piled up. The wind chimes stopped ringing. The house took on a stillness that wasn't restful. It was resentful. No apology came. No confrontation followed. Instead, there was the hum of surveillance, the sense that something was being restructured, not abandoned. Alice didn't lower her guard. She maintained her documentation, updated her logs, and waited. Then, one morning, as she walked to the curb to collect her trash bin, she found a scratch running the length of her car door. It wasn't deep, but it was deliberate. Low enough that someone had to bend down to do it, long enough to cover both panels on the driver's side. There were no cameras pointed that way, no witnesses, just the mark and the message it carried. Nothing is off limits now. Alice didn't file a police report immediately. Instead, she took photos, ran a timeline, and emailed everything to Renee. Her lawyer responded with a single sentence. "Now we go formal." Because the midpoint wasn't a resolution. It wasn't relief. It was confirmation that this was a campaign. And Alice wasn't retreating. She was fortifying. Alice had always believed that escalation had a rhythm. In every dispute she'd ever mediated at work, every silent war she'd observed between colleagues who spoke through omissions and posture rather than raised voices, she had learned to detect the moment when a conflict transitioned from frustration to fixation. It was never loud. It was never declared. It was simply a shift, a thinning of the line between intention and obsession. She recognized it now, plainly, in the change that came over Karen's property like a fog. Her lights no longer turned on at random. They flickered at precise intervals. Her blinds no longer opened to check the weather or watch the mailman. They opened only when Alice stood still for longer than a minute. Her silence had transformed from withdrawal into surveillance. After the car was scratched, Alice brought her vehicle to a body shop outside town. Not the closest one, not the most affordable, but one that didn't ask questions and was willing to keep a discreet receipt. The technician didn't blink at the damage. "Intentional," he said. "Low angle, consistent pressure, fingertip work." He didn't need to say more. Alice paid in cash and drove home with her windows down, watching for tailing vehicles even though she knew none would appear. Karen was many things, but clumsy was not one of them. She didn't get caught. She got even. The day the new trash dispute began, it started with a detail so small Alice nearly overlooked it. Her bin, freshly emptied and returned to the curb, was no longer on the line of her driveway. It was angled, barely perceptibly, into Karen's yard, the wheels tucked against her side of the curb like a breech waiting to be named. Alice thought it was just a careless placement, until the following week, when it happened again. This time, a neon pink sticker was affixed to the side of the bin. Out of boundary. Correct placement required. The sticker had no logo, no city branding. It was printed from a home office but laminated, deliberately so. There was no signature. Alice peeled it off and placed it into her log binder. 3 days later, her mailbox was left open in the rain. Nothing was stolen, but the letters were soaked. The next morning, she awoke to find that her hose had been disconnected at the spigot. Not damaged, not cut, but unscrewed with surgical precision. Her begonias were wilted, visibly stressed by the sudden absence of water overnight. Alice didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply tightened the hose, watered the flowers by hand, and made another entry in the log. Renee advised against confronting Karen directly. "No good comes from unrecorded emotion," she said. "We control the narrative. We don't give her footage." But the line Karen crossed next was physical. Alice returned from a grocery run one afternoon to find her back gate unlocked and slightly ajar. Nothing was missing. No signs of forced entry, no damage. But she was meticulous about that gate. She checked it every night and each morning. It was a habit as reflexive as brushing her teeth. She called Renee, who advised a locksmith immediately. The locksmith, a local woman with military posture and no tolerance for small talk, inspected the latch and offered a quiet comment. "No sign of tampering. Someone either has a key or opened it while you were out." She replaced the entire lock assembly with a reinforced deadbolt and gave Alice 3 keys. Alice stored 2, one in a lockbox, the other with Renee. She kept the third on her person at all times. Later that week, Karen sent a formal letter. It was folded neatly, slipped under Alice's door, not mailed, on official stationery that bore the watermark of a community development firm, one that, upon inspection, no longer operated. The letter alleged that recent complaints had been submitted by concerned residents about aggressive landscaping practices, including visual obstructions, unauthorized environmental modifications, and a history of willful disregard for communal aesthetics. The letter concluded with a soft but unmistakable warning. Failure to align with neighborhood expectations may result in coordinated community action. Alice made 3 copies of the letter, emailed a scan to Renee, and called. The non-emergency number for the local code compliance office. She didn't accuse. She inquired, calmly. "Am I in violation of any current municipal or residential codes related to landscaping or exterior fixtures?" The man on the other end, bored but professional, looked up her address. "Nothing on file," he said. "You're clear." But being clear didn't mean being safe. The next escalation came in the form of noise. It started with soft static at odd hours, low but constant. A frequency that didn't carry music, didn't carry speech. It pulsed from somewhere behind the hedges separating their yards, and Alice could only hear it when she sat on her porch at night. At first, she thought it was electronic interference. She walked around the edge of her yard, trying to pinpoint it, but the sound faded and returned like a tide. It wasn't until the 3rd night that she realized what it was. A directional sound emitter, possibly Bluetooth, possibly ultrasonic, aimed deliberately and activated when motion was detected. The goal wasn't to annoy. It was to create unease, a kind of weaponized presence. Alice bought a decibel meter. She logged the readings at different times from different angles and sent the results to Renee. "It won't win us a lawsuit," Renee said, "but it documents intention. And that's a pattern." Alice filed a quiet noise disturbance report with the city, fully aware that without a consistent decibel threshold, the complaint would die in a folder. But it wasn't about enforcement. It was about establishing continuity. Meanwhile, Alice's garden began to suffer. At first, it was just a few leaves, curled at the edges, spotted with rot that seemed unnatural. She suspected overwatering, then drought stress, then pests. She adjusted her schedule, added compost, checked for insects. Then the tomato vines yellowed overnight, not wilted, discolored as if something had been introduced to the soil. She dug shallow, and the smell hit her. Bleach. Not strong, not overwhelming, but present. Impossible to mistake. Someone had poured a chemical into the roots. Alice stood there for a long time, trowel in hand, sweat beating at her temples despite the breeze. The weight of it wasn't in the act. It was in the certainty. This was the point of no return. She collected soil samples, sealed them, labeled the dates. She filed a formal incident report and requested testing at a local environmental lab. The results, which came 2 weeks later, confirmed the presence of non-natural agents, chlorine compounds inconsistent with gardening use. Renee drafted a second formal complaint, this time with attached lab documentation, and submitted it to the city as part of an official request for neighborhood mediation. But Karen responded first, with sound and movement. She hosted a gathering, not a party. Too sterile for that. It was a curated outdoor lawn symposium, as the flyers claimed. A casual afternoon of garden lectures, wine tastings, and community cultivation dialogue. Alice received a flyer, slipped into her mailbox, though no one else on the street seemed to acknowledge it. When the day arrived, folding chairs were set up on Karen's lawn, small speakers were arranged in perfect intervals, and a soft PA system played pre-recorded nature sounds between segments. Alice stayed inside. From her living room, she could hear it all. The carefully rehearsed lectures about visual discipline, the commentary on neighborhood tone, the discussions about mutual accountability in unregulated green space. It wasn't about gardens. It was about control. The entire event was staged to rewrite the narrative, to present Karen as the protector of community integrity and Alice as the anarchist with a trowel. That night, Alice sent one final email. Not to Renee. Not to the city. To a reporter. Not a national name. Not a tabloid hunter. A local columnist who covered quiet suburban stories, land use disputes, policy changes, municipal meetings. Her email was concise, factual, and backed by over 40 pages of documentation. She didn't ask for a story. She offered records. In case you're ever looking into how local harassment evolves quietly, without a single raised voice. The reporter didn't reply. But 2 weeks later, a city council member announced a review of neighborhood surveillance practices and unauthorized property disputes, without naming names, without singling out incidents. Alice recognized the phrasing and the language used. Her phrasing, her file, her words. Karen responded by turning off her lights. No more cameras, no more flood lamps, no more blinds flicking open. The house across the fence fell into a curtain of stillness that felt heavier than noise. It didn't mean surrender. It meant recalibration. Alice didn't celebrate. She sat in her garden, now recovering with new soil and new roots. The bleach had been cleared. The hoses were checked nightly. The gate was secured. And she kept watering, knowing the sun would do its part, knowing that sometimes the only thing more resilient than silence was stubborn, measured light. The quiet didn't last. Alice had no illusions about that. Silence, in this kind of standoff, was never a truce. It was preparation. The lights had gone dark, the cameras had stopped rotating, and Karen's presence, once orchestrated through shadows and angles and the timing of her glances, had seemingly receded, but Alice could feel the tension crystallizing. It wasn't over. It had just changed shape. The days grew shorter. The evenings crept in faster. Alice found herself checking the locks earlier, replacing the batteries in her motion sensors with the same automatic diligence as watering her plants. She didn't fear Karen the way one fears danger. She feared what Karen was willing to become when she felt her control slipping, because people like her didn't want to win. They needed to own the terms of surrender, and Alice had refused to surrender on any of them. One Thursday morning, the irrigation stopped entirely. Not weak, not fluctuating, stopped. She went out back and checked the system, certain it was a mechanical issue, a valve or a fuse. But when she reached the box, she found the main connector cleanly removed and tucked behind the base of a planter. Unscrewed, not damaged, no sign of a break-in or tool marks. Just intentional deactivation. The kind that said someone had entered her property again, unnoticed. There were no footprints, no bent branches, nothing visible. But the fact of the act was undeniable. This was no longer about disruption. This was provocation. A silent dare. Alice made the repairs herself. She didn't file a report. She didn't even tell Renee. She knew the system, knew how much evidence it took for someone to be believed when nothing was caught on camera and no voices were raised. She simply added another page to the log, another timestamp, another measurement of intent. 3 nights later, her electricity flickered for the first time, only outside. Patio lights, the garage sensor, the garden path bulbs. Inside, everything stayed on. She checked the panel. No tripped breakers. She checked the connections. No evidence of water, rodents, or wear. The flicker was rhythmic, controlled. Enough to unnerve, never enough to warrant a service call. It happened again 2 days later and again the following week. Always for under a minute. Always after sundown. Renee sent an electrician, a quiet man in his 40s with the gait of someone who'd seen worse neighborhoods. He did a sweep and confirmed her suspicion. Tampering, but subtle. Someone had adjusted the external connection box just enough to cause intermittent disruption, just enough to avoid permanent damage. "They're not trying to break your house," he said. "They're trying to make you feel like it could fall apart at any moment." Alice nodded and thanked him. She didn't need to be told. Then came the legal envelope. Delivered by courier, signature required. The return address wasn't Karen's directly. It was from a regional real estate law firm. Inside was a formal complaint. Not a lawsuit, not yet, but a notice of intent to seek legal action for sustained nuisance and environmental harm. The allegations were carefully constructed. Installation of unregulated reflective equipment resulting in heat damage, light, pollution affecting adjacent residents, harassment through noise and visual obstruction, and hostile landscaping practices that deviate from accepted aesthetic standards of the street. There was no mention of cameras, no mention of bleach, no reference to the scratches or the stolen mirror. The document was built to erase every offense Karen had committed and replace it with an alternate history in which Alice had been the aggressor all along. The timeline had been reversed, the narrative inverted. It was a masterpiece of projection, one that, if uncontested, could easily be accepted by a court more interested in patterns of escalation than in justice. It even included neighborhood statements, 3 of them, unsigned but formatted like declarations. Uncomfortable with tone. Aggressive garden architecture. Refused to engage in civil dialogue. Vague enough to land, empty enough to stick. Alice brought the letter to Renee the next morning. They met at a small office off Main, neutral ground. No one from either street likely to pass by. Renee read the complaint in silence, her lips tightening only once. When she finished, she looked up and said, "This is her swing. The one she's been building toward. She wants to push you into defensive mode, into panic." She took out a pen and began outlining the counter-strategy. They would file a formal response, not reactive but assertive. Comprehensive documentation of every incident, every tampering, every interaction. They would subpoena service records, request environmental reports, and attach the soil analysis that confirmed chemical contamination. They would, if necessary, submit a motion for restraining conditions on physical interference with property. "But that's not the goal," Renee said, her voice low. "You know that, right? The goal isn't to win. She wants you to break routine, to vacate, to sell." Alice didn't answer. She didn't need to. The only thing she'd been more committed to than her garden was her refusal to be exiled from a home she had built from silence. Renee continued outlining steps. Deadline notices, timeline synchronizations, potential character witnesses, expert testimony on light angles and garden design. It wasn't an assault plan. It was a wall. Thick, unyielding, procedural. That night, Alice walked through her yard in the dark. No lights on. Just her and the path. The moon was full, casting long shadows across the newly repaired beds and trimmed edges. She sat near the trellis, back against the cedar, and watched Karen's house. There was no movement, no sound, but the house seemed to pulse with expectation, like a place that had learned how to wait. Alice didn't blink. She simply waited, too. The following weekend, a fire inspection notice appeared on her door. Unannounced, unexpected. A city official arrived that Monday, clipboard in hand, asking to inspect suspected unpermitted heating devices or outdoor electrical work. Alice let him in, showed him the outdoor lines, the garden fixtures, the irrigation box. He found nothing, wrote it down, left without comment. She knew the inspection wouldn't end in a citation. That wasn't the point. The point was the record, the appearance of concern, the fog of doubt. Karen wasn't done. The final act before court came quietly. Alice's mailbox was removed. Not vandalized, unbolted. Taken entirely from the post, screws removed and placed neatly on the ground. The box itself was gone. No note, no trace, just a vacancy. The symbolism wasn't subtle. Her connection to the outside world, messages, deliveries, identity, had been removed, not destroyed. Erased. Alice replaced it the same day, installed a lockable model, filed a report, took photos, called her insurance company to preempt any anonymous claims of mail tampering, sent a copy to Renee, sent another to the city. No emotion, just procedure. The pressure mounted, but Alice's steps remained unchanged. She didn't isolate. She didn't react in public. She kept her routines exact: early morning gardening, controlled communication, perimeter checks, weekly calls with Renee. She didn't seek allies. She didn't knock on neighbors' doors. She knew how Karen worked. Any alliance would be used as evidence of collusion, of division. Alice refused to play that part, and so the final weeks before the court date passed under a veil of artificial calm. The trees remained trimmed. The lights flickered once, then stopped. No more scratches, no more hose tampering, just quiet. But that quiet was coiled, and the strike was coming. The courtroom was small, suffocatingly beige and far less dramatic than television had prepared Alice for. There were no gasps, no banging gavels, only the shuffling of papers, the occasional hum of a malfunctioning vent, and the voice of a clerk who called her name with bored precision. She sat beside Renee, her binder tucked tightly into her lap, her breath even but shallow. Karen entered moments later with her attorney, a sharply dressed man who looked built for real estate litigation, but not for the kind of psychological trench war this had turned into. Karen herself looked composed, her expression neutral, her hair pinned exactly the same way it had been the day Alice first met her, immaculately preserved, like a porcelain figure that had never admitted to heat or dust or damage. The judge wasn't interested in personalities. He was interested in the timeline, in cause and effect, in paperwork, and Alice had brought paperwork. Renee presented it cleanly. The incident log, the photographs, the soil analysis, the city correspondence, the copy of the fraudulent letter, the notarized statements, the electrician's report, and the documentation proving the mirror's legal installation and subsequent theft. It wasn't an attack. It was architecture. Each piece fit into the next, and the overall structure didn't scream for sympathy. It demonstrated pressure, pattern, and method. Karen's side pushed back with words, not proof. Claims about discomfort, about neighborhood culture, about the stress of visual intrusion and the emotional toll of unpredictable neighbors. Her attorney emphasized disruption of atmosphere, a phrase that made the judge raise an eyebrow and flip a page. When asked directly if she had ever contacted city authorities or submitted any complaints before the attorney letter, Karen hesitated. Just enough. She hadn't. There were no reports, no tickets, just a narrative built after the fact. The judge didn't deliver his ruling dramatically. He acknowledged the escalating tension, confirmed that both parties had contributed to a deteriorating relationship, but ultimately found that Alice had remained within legal bounds throughout. The complaint was dismissed. No damages were awarded, no further action required. But the most important line came last, almost offhandedly, buried in procedural language. Any further interference with Alice Powell's property or utilities would constitute grounds for a restraining order. Karen didn't react. Her attorney thanked the judge. They left quickly, efficiently, like people trying to control a retreat. Alice remained seated until the room emptied. Renee said nothing, but her hand tapped twice on the table, a quiet signal of approval. Outside the courthouse, the light was sharp, unfriendly. Alice didn't feel victorious. She felt intact. When she returned home, the street looked the same. Children played across the way. The air smelled of cut grass and gasoline. Karen's house stood quiet, blinds closed, the camera poles removed. Alice didn't check her locks. She didn't sweep the perimeter. She watered her garden slowly, speaking to nothing, just listening to the rhythm of the hose and the distant sound of someone hammering in a yard 3 doors down. That night, she slept with the windows open, not because she believed it was over, but because she was no longer afraid of what it meant if it wasn't. The mirror was never recovered. Her mailbox was never found. But in the weeks that followed, something shifted. Not in Karen, who remained silent behind her walls, but in the others. A neighbor who had once only nodded now waved. A package that had been repeatedly delayed arrived on time, intact. The couple on the corner stopped by with extra citrus from their tree. No one mentioned Karen. No one referenced the court. But Alice understood what it meant. Her refusal to fold had become visible. And sometimes that was enough. The garden thrived. The lavender returned. The tomatoes survived. The trellis grew thick with vine. One evening in late spring, Alice stood by her kitchen window and saw Karen at the edge of her lawn, motionless.